Does intergenerational trauma ever become an excuse for not taking responsibility? Indigenous women and domestic abuse, what's the root cause of it?
Colonisation is the root cause of it, not
domestic
actually
violence?
in our culture to do that.
Would you say that I have white privilege?
I think there's such thing as positive anti-discrimination.
If our CVs were the same, in a system like that, you could get a seat at the table because of your Indigenous status. I wouldn't get an interview. Would you see why some people who would be not Indigenous would view that as unfair racism against them?
I don't think if they were educated on the history of our country, they would. They've had more opportunity than me. You should be more qualified than me. I think that's the way I would look at it. You should be above me. If you're not, it's probably because I'm deadly.
The police, for example, like the system they built on, right? They built on racism.
Tell me more. Tell me more. So why do you think that the police are
Racist?
racist? You can't be racist to white people. It's not possible.
Oh shit!
You hold that position. Thanks, mate. Ladies and gents, welcome back to another episode of Common Ground Conversations, where we ask the important but controversial questions, then try to find common ground. It is a gorgeous sunny day here in Melbourne, Australia. NAIDOC week, celebrating Australian Indigenous culture. We're going to be asking the question, what is racism? Let's see what people have to say. All right, a little context before we jump into the first convo of the day. What is racism is an open and broad question. It's not a simple yes or no answer. And so I had a couple of related sub-questions that I brought with me on the day, including what is systemic racism? What is white privilege? What is the root cause of Indigenous incarceration? Indigenous deaths in custody? Indigenous child custody rates, as well as Indigenous domestic violence rates. So if at any point in the episode I go down a rabbit hole that doesn't really interest you, feel free to jump ahead to the next convo using the timestamps that I've popped in the description. Also, something new I've done for this episode is include references to any data that I present, so if you're interested, you'll be able to access all of my sources via the links in the description. For my own clarity and revision, I made this comparison table that just runs through some of the important metrics comparing Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations and their outcomes. I published it on the net for those of you who'd like to check it out as well. Lastly, a quick thank you to everyone that's been showing us love, whether it's in the comment section or DMing us on Insta. I see you, I appreciate you, and I'm glad to have you along for the ride. With that said, let's dive into convo number one for the day. Enjoy. Racism and unpack that a little bit. So for you, what is racism?
It's a really complex structure that's evolved through colonialism as a way to divide people and subjugate people from different cultures by people from other cultures. So race wasn't really a thing until slavery was invented. And then they started using it as an excuse for
What do you mean? Hold on. What do you mean race wasn't invented?
So race is a social construct. Race isn't really something inherent to people at their core. Yes, people look different, but the concept of someone being white, the concept of someone else being, Aboriginal or whatever that is, that's all social. That's all constructed by people.
Is there part of it that is biologically rooted?
I mean, yeah, sure, but there's biological variation in people from the same area.
Agreed,
so,
absolutely. But I would say that the term race, as far as I'm aware, and feel free to kind of open my eyes here, but I would say that race, we've used the word race to refer to significantly different genetic pools.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's what it's come to mean. But overall, it is a social construct rather than people actually being inherently different from each other.
Right, so it can be used as a term to say you are fundamentally different from me, and losing sight of, say, our shared humanity.
Yeah.
Being able to see that, just because, say, I have brown hair and you have red hair, doesn't change the fact that we are fundamentally humans. Same goes for something like skin color.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so you said something about structures.
Yeah. Power structures.
So another question that I wanted to ask people today was, what is systemic racism? Do you believe it's a thing?
Yes.
And how exactly would you define it?
I would define it as there being certain institutions which are set up to favour the rights of individuals from one race or group, whether that is, the straight community or the white community over another, say LGBTIQ people, Aboriginal people, non-white people, all those sorts of things.
And what would be some of those structures? Because I think it's important that when we say that there's a problem, kind of drawing a circle around what exactly the problem is in order to then find a solution. So
well, as a historian, I find it really interesting to look at how a lot of these institutions that kind of run our society were actually founded. For example, if you look at something like police, originally, they were largely designed to be slave catchers in the United States. So they were designed for private people who owned people, and they would use that to retrieve their property when people ran away, if that makes sense.
Specifically, if we could
Yeah.
stay in the Oz context.
Yeah.
Are there things right now that you can point to and say that's evidence of or an example of systemic racism, and then
Yeah.
perhaps how you would suggest fixing it?
Yeah. So at the moment we have a problem of over-incarceration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We have instances of people dying in custody at a far higher rate if they are of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background than by the same percentage of people who are not. And there's clearly in many communities an institutional prejudice that has been set up which posits Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities against the non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities.
Okay, so let's see if we can zoom in a little bit more on deaths in custody,
Yeah.
because I think that's a tragedy. So what would you say exactly is the problem there? What's causing what's the root cause of Aboriginal deaths in custody or Indigenous deaths in custody? And what would you say could be a potential solution?
I think more cultural competency training needs to be given to people that work in law enforcement to understand the unique set of circumstances and requirements that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people require.
What would you say those are?
Well, I'm not an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person, so I don't really feel comfortable saying this is what they need.
No, that's all good.
But
Yeah.
I think, look, there are lots of people advocating for this stuff online. I would point you in the direction of the family of Tanya Day as an example of an Aboriginal woman who was arrested for public intoxication on a train and later died in police custody.
Maybe we'll pop a link up for people who are watching.
Yeah.
So I'm familiar with that case,
Yeah.
and I watched the interviews with both of her daughters, I believe,
Yeah.
afterwards, and they claimed that the reason why she died in custody was because of her race or because of her Indigenous status.
Because she's a black woman, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that that day from every interaction that someone had with mum is because she was a black woman.
Yeah,
I'm not sure I personally agree with that.
sure.
And this is part of the reason why I want to see whether we can get really clear about what the root cause of some of these things are, because I'm very much an advocate of problems first, solutions second.
Yep.
If we try and propose solutions before properly defining the problem, then we run into issues. So if we come back to Indigenous deaths in custody, do you have any idea of, like, for people watching at home who might not be familiar with it, do you have any idea of what the stats are in terms of how many Indigenous versus non-Indigenous people die in custody?
Yeah.
And what percentage?
I'm not sure about those statistics exactly, but I can tell you that Aboriginal people are the most incarcerated people on earth, percentage-wise. So that's higher than Māori people, that's higher
Big
than
problem.
African Americans.
Yeah.
Yep.
Definitely. So that's definitely a problem that needs to be solved, or something that everyone wants to improve, a situation that everyone wants to improve.
Yeah.
If I were to show you, let's say, for example, there's a particular group of Indigenous people, let's say 1,000 Indigenous people, 1,000 non-Indigenous people who go into incarceration.
Yeah.
If both died, I mean, obviously anyone dying in custody is horrible. If both died at the same rate,
Yeah. Well,
Would
then we
you-
would just have a deaths in custody problem, which we do,
Right.
but it is disproportionately affecting this particular group.
right. So something I'd like to get clear on, and you can, perhaps I can, show this to you afterwards, or pop some links in the video.
Sure.
But between 1989
Yep.
and 1996,
Yep.
there was that Royal Commission that looked into Aboriginal deaths in custody in particular.
Yep.
And they found that Indigenous people were 25% more likely to die if they were incarcerated.
Yep.
And so there were all of these suggestions as a consequence of the report. There was a follow-up report 25 years later
Yeah.
that was released in 2018, 2019.
Yep.
And between 2008 and 2018, if you went into custody as a non-Indigenous person,
Yeah.
you were actually 60% more likely to die.
Okay.
Which,
That's not
which
good
I
either.
thought, which I thought was very surprising.
Yeah,
so
sure.
for me, that seems, obviously anyone's death in custody is an issue, it's a problem. So in terms of defining what the problem is, I would then say Indigenous incarceration rates, we want those to go down. We don't want anyone to be incarcerated,
Yeah.
including Indigenous people.
Yeah.
But that the problem is sometimes misdiagnosed as being somewhere that it might not be. You see what I mean?
Yeah, sure. It's hard for me because I don't know all these statistics up by heart. All I know is that there is an overrepresentation problem. There's also a problem of what's it called?
Like going reoffending?
Reoffending rates are really high. It's often for really trivial stuff like unpaid debts or parking fines, not being, driving with the license. Things that, as a whole, you're not seeing white people being incarcerated for at the same percentage, which I think that demonstrates that there is a structural racism present.
Yeah. And so, in that sense, would you define systemic racism as like a difference in outcome between
Yes.
racial groups?
Yes.
Okay. Interesting. Lovely. Well,
Yeah.
I'm gonna kick on and have
No
a chat to
worries.
some other people.
No
Nice
worries.
chatting with you.
Yeah, you too.
Take care.
You going on the high school reunion?
When is it?
I don't know.
Maybe. We'll see. Position of authority.
Yeah.
So I want to read you this quote. Treating, considering, or making a distinction in favour or against an individual based on that person's race. Would you say that that's racism?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's where I would find common ground with you.
Yeah.
I want to go deeper on the systemic side of things.
Mm-hmm.
So, because my sense, like, I'm very much of the belief that if we have a problem, it's really important to clearly define the problem first and then generate solutions. And if we jump to generating solutions too early or too quickly without a proper understanding of the problem, we get nowhere. We have ineffective solutions, which can actually cause more harm than good. It can move us in the wrong direction. So with something like systemic racism, how would you define systemic racism? And then follow on to that is like, how do you fix it?
Systemic racism. Can you give me a definition of systemic racism?
Oh, that's what I'm asking, right?
What I think systemic racism is.
I mean, do you believe in systemic racism?
I don't actually quite. I've never heard systemic racism.
Oh,
before.
okay.
Yeah.
I know that some people will define systemic racism as being
Is that what you mean?
well, kind of power and policy or structures that result in unequal outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations.
People.
So say, for example, Indigenous deaths in custody.
Yes.
Or even Indigenous incarceration rates. That's where someone might point to that and say that's evidence of systemic racism.
I think that's evidence of colonisation. I think the gap that exists between education, health, every gap that exists between our people is from colonisation and what happened, and it still hasn't been dealt with. So that that gap that you constantly hear closing the gap, but actually do some research. The census data is coming out, and have a look at what that gap is, because I'm still supposed to die a lot younger than my non-Indigenous friend. No matter how I grew up, it's shocking to read the statistics, and it's hard to live as an Aboriginal person to think this is the opportunity I've been given. Like, my grandmother was born in a tree. All my friends' grandparents give them money when they pass away. You know what I mean? Like, it's just such a different thing, and I've obviously grown up in Melbourne, and I'm so different to all my friends. Health, education. Our family were the first people to finish school. It's just, we don't understand that gap.
Yeah, so something that I was doing a little bit of research for today and trying to wrap my head around some of those differences in group outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. One thing that really struck me, I just got a potent whiff there.
Yeah.
The one thing that really struck me was the difference in educational attainment between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations, and the type of implication that can have further down the track for something like employment, and then welfare payments, etc. from there. So something that really struck me was, yes, there is a difference in educational attainment, and we can have a conversation around what exactly is the cause of that. But then I think it was, maybe I'll throw something up on the screen. It was either Australian Bureau of Statistics or something along those lines, census data, that looked into people, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, who attained a Year 12 qualification. Was there a difference in employment between them? And there was none, or no significant difference. So to me, that looks like there's not necessarily racial profiling in hiring practices, but more so there's an underlying difference in educational attainment, and then if we want to change that, that's the conversation we have. Like, what's going on there? So in your eyes, if we want to say solve that problem, where do you think that starts? What's the solution?
I think there's such thing as positive anti-discrimination. My whole job is to employ Indigenous people for every store around the country. I head up Indigenous affairs at And if you've got a 25-year-old candidate that's Indigenous and one that's non-Indigenous, one's finished school, one probably hasn't. So therefore, you're going to hire the person that's finished school. So yes, as you're saying, they're
Sorry,
both...
just to clarify, that the one, are you saying that the one who
the
finished
non-Indigenous person who hasn't finished school compared to the Indigenous who has finished school normally would hire the person that's more educated. Right? But that's, and as you're saying, if they both finish school, then they would have equal opportunity, but they already don't because of that gap. We know Indigenous people are way less likely to finish school because they've got to help provide for their family. Their parents probably haven't worked before because their parents probably didn't go to school.
So in an instance like that, if you have two applicants, so I know that some people might call...
That's why I think we need to give that opportunity to our Indigenous candidates. And my whole role at we have a completely separate hiring process for Indigenous people based on the fact that they need support. They're not like non-Indigenous people where they don't have that support. I have young kids that they can't ask their parents, can you help me with an interview prep, because their parents might not have worked before. So that's my job, is to actually help and to have people like myself in Indigenous roles in bigger organisations to encourage that, as I said, positive anti-discrimination, to give that opportunity.
Positive anti-discrimination.
Yeah.
Is that, I'm just trying to wrap my head around, would that be, my sense is some people would call that reverse racism.
Yeah.
In the sense that you're discriminating for Indigenous Australians in a way to try and include them or pull
to
them
provide
up,
that
so to
opportunity.
speak. Yeah, and so I know that some people call it reverse racism, some people might call it affirmative action but gone too far, something like that. What would you say to those people?
I'm saying
do you see a distinction, sorry to
No,
cut
you're
you
right.
off. Would you see a difference, where would you say that it does become racism just in the opposite direction?
Yeah, we don't hire people because they are Aboriginal. We just give them the opportunity to be interviewed, because when a manager's looking at their resume is not going to look as good as the non-Indigenous candidates. So we're just giving the opportunity to have a seat at the table, and we're trying to, as I said, that opportunity really doesn't exist for our people. If you look through the stats, and it's really interesting. So a football sport, so NRL and AFL are the biggest sports. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are 3% of the population, and we make up, if you take age out of that, about 1% of our population are able to play NRL or AFL. We make up over 20% of those sports. So our people don't lack talent, and they just lack the opportunity.
Right. So
in an academic sense, sport's a bit different, because if you're good, you're good. But in an academic sense, we haven't been given that opportunity, which is why we need to be giving that opportunity to our Indigenous people.
So something I've been trying to kind of understand and unpack is there are certain instances, say for example in that instance, you might say that Indigenous Australians are overrepresented in a particular sporting field, and that's not necessarily evidence of discrimination against non-Indigenous people. It might just be a cultural preference or value for that sport and training and whatnot. I've been trying to make sense of why do we apply that logic in one direction but not the other. So say for example, if there is a difference in say wealth or income or educational attainment between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, why we might, or some people might characterise that as being evidence of systemic racism in one direction, but then when there is overrepresentation of Indigenous in a particular field, that's not classified as systemic racism. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, and I think this whole professional world is a side of things that, I was fortunate enough to do a traineeship prior to my role that I currently have now, and I wouldn't have had that opportunity if I wasn't Indigenous, and I think that that's allowed me to be where I am today. So those traineeships and those, my dad didn't finish school because he was severely bullied. My nan was fauna and fauna up until she was 30, so that's the difference. Think about your parents and think about the opportunities, even just being able to be born in a hospital and the health benefits that your grandma would have from that compared to mine. Therefore,
would you say that I have white privilege?
Are you not Indigenous?
I'm not Indigenous.
I would say non-Indigenous people have privilege based on the fact that their elders were able to have rights. They were, my nan wasn't able to get a home loan, wasn't able to get a job, wasn't able to go into the supermarket. She wasn't able to do anything. Their Halforism, that's supposed to empower my dad. So that generation of, my dad's generation of Aboriginal people are now having kids, and we're the ones that have to take this opportunity and take these traineeships and these opportunities. So we're empowering our kids. We've finished school, we've got jobs.
Do you see how, let's say for example, you and I applied for a job, and you had on yours that you were Indigenous and I had on mine that I was non-Indigenous, and you and I had the same qualifications, the fact that you get a seat at the table and I wouldn't.
I don't think you wouldn't, though. I don't think places discriminate like
Didn't
that.
you just say that that's what happens?
No, traineeships don't actually. Well, no, the thing is, I wouldn't have got a seat at the table because I don't have the same qualifications as you. So that's what the issue is. Is the gap in, look at how many...
Right. Well, I mean,
yeah,
isn't that even... So if I have greater qualifications than you,
yeah,
and I apply for the job, and you don't have...
We're both just being interviewed. We've both got the
But I might be
opportunity.
rejected, but you would be interviewed?
No, we're both being interviewed. If you've got a great CV and you're non-Indigenous, if you've got a great CV...
But if my CV were the same as yours, a hypothetical situation, right? If our CVs were the same,
yeah,
in a system like that, you could get a seat at the table because of your Indigenous status. I wouldn't get an interview.
I don't look at it like that.
But that is what would happen, right? It might we can frame it in different ways, but I guess would you see why some people who would be not Indigenous would view that as unfair racism against them?
I don't think if they were educated on the history of our country, they would. I don't think it's fair that they could. They've had more opportunity than me. You should be more qualified than me. I think that's the way I would look at it. I don't think.
So given you.
And maybe our
correct me
grandchildren,
if I'm
it
wrong.
might be different, but our generation, there's such a gap. Like, my nan was a plant until she was 30. Like, the difference, I've got non-Indigenous friends, their grandparents pass away, they get given money and they've got generational health, knowledge, education.
Yeah,
I don't
pass on.
have that.
Yep.
Therefore, you should be above me. If you're not, it's probably because I'm deadly.
Right. So if a non-Indigenous person is not more qualified to get a seat at the table, then they don't deserve one. Is that like another way of putting it?
I don't know. It's a bit of a tricky question.
Yeah. Now I don't mean to put words in your mouth. I'm just trying to present it from the completely opposite perspective, and see whether we can find some common ground. Because let's say, for example, you could assume perhaps that being not Indigenous, I ought to, on average, I might have a greater wealth or greater set of or a greater income. My parents might have on average a higher income or educational attainment, something like, compared to on average a non-Indigenous person. But to say that I, because of my non-Indigenous status, am privileged, to me that seems a little bit racist because it's assuming that
I wouldn't say you're privileged.
if you just I'm not saying necessarily you, but some people might say this. That given my non-Indigenous status, that I have privilege, and it's kind of bestowing upon me my group identity as opposed to actually understanding the specifics of my situation. So you may be not Indigenous. Sorry, I may be not Indigenous. You may be Indigenous, but you may have grown up with two parents in the home. I may have grown up in a foster care system. You may have grown up with two parents who both have a stable income. I might have grown up with two parents who are bankrupt. So I guess my concern is I can understand why people would see a system like that as being racist against non-Indigenous people, and to kind of try and present it from your position. I can also understand and am supportive of a degree of affirmative action that tries to identify talent and pull them out and give them opportunity where we can give them
for diversity and inclusion. That we also look at disability. Are you going to sit there and say, well, how come somebody with a disability gets an employment opportunity over me?
I don't understand your point.
So at most big organisations, we've got diversity and inclusion, and First Nations...
Boys, move on.
First Nations sits under that, and so does disability. Therefore, as a non-Indigenous person, would you say it's unfair that people with disabilities have employment assistance to help them gain employment?
Well, I would say...
Would you say that's unfair?
Potentially, yeah. So I would, and you can help me unpack this because I might be missing something. But I would say the person who is applying, say for a position, let's say you and I run a company, we have a position, the person who applies and who has the best qualifications and has earned the role, I would say they deserve the position, whether they're in a wheelchair or not, whether they have any kind of disability.
Yeah, but it's not a matter of them getting the job over you, it's a matter of them having more assistance. They have people to help them go into the interview, they get interview prep, they get that further support, and that's what we have for our First Nations people and for people with disability.
Yeah, right, and so that's where I would say that there's a degree of affirmative action that can be really beneficial in taking people who may not have opportunity and giving them that opportunity to flourish. And
Yeah.
I think most people are for that.
Yeah.
I just know that some people have the concern that it's going to be taken too far to the point of racism in the opposite direction. And
Yeah.
so what did you call it before? You called it
Positive anti-discrimination.
and my brain like does a little circle to try and like it's like I've got
Yeah.
that little Mac
Yeah.
beach ball
Yeah.
going around. So I want to read you another quote, and I
Yeah.
want to tell you, see what you think about it. So by the way, these are quotes from How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Okay.
So have you read that book?
No,
So
no.
it's by a gentleman called Ibram X Kendi.
Yeah.
And I've read books on all sides of the political spectrum to try and understand both positions. And
Yeah.
again, like our entire YouTube channel is about ideally finding common ground. I have a position on most things, but I'm very much open to being swayed one way or the other.
Yeah.
So that quote that I read before was by Kendi. So that's where you would have said that. I think you would have said that was racist. I certainly thought that it was a racist thing to discriminate based solely on someone's skin color.
Yep.
But I'll read the rest of the quote, and you tell me whether your position changes. So it's here. This is the part I read. If racial discrimination is defined as treating, considering, or making a distinction in favor or against an individual based on that person's race, then racial discrimination is not inherently racist. Now, I personally disagree with that statement.
Too many words for me.
So essentially, discriminating for or against someone based solely on their skin color,
Yep.
I would say that's racist.
Yep.
What Kendi is trying to argue is that if discrimination, quote, if discrimination is creating equity, so equality of outcome between racial groups, then it is anti-racist. If discrimination is creating inequity, then it is racist. And I know that I've just put in brackets there neo-Marxism, because I know that some people would consider that as being a rehashing of Marxism. So saying that any discrepancy between two groups of people, the discrepancy exists because of oppression of one to the other.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily agree with that. What's your take? Like, would you? It sounds.
Again, it's just getting so complicated.
So
It's so complicated.
when you said before, I keep forgetting the phrase you used. Positive
Anti-discrimination.
anti-discrimination. My sense is that to me that sounds a little bit Kendi-ish. So we might find some disagreement there, but this is what we're about. With something like, I want to kind of switch lanes here and move into something that I've seen a lot of signs for here. Also, what a vibe. But a lot of signs for Indigenous deaths in custody.
Yep.
So I want to kind of unpack that with you, and we've touched on educational attainment. Where to even begin? So I guess there's evidently a problem
Yep.
with deaths in custody. No one is for deaths in custody. We have a problem, we want to solve it. An additional layer to that problem is that Indigenous people are disproportionately represented in the incarceration, or they're disproportionately incarcerated. And there are also concerns around the rate at which they die in custody. So would you view that as evidence of systemic racism? And if you did, like, how do you go about solving it? Where do you begin?
It's a big question.
Sorry to drop a big question.
No.
That's what we're about. Like, I want to kind of unpack
it's
this.
probably a question with somebody that's a little bit more knowledgeable than me. I just know that there's a high chance that an Aboriginal boy will go to prison and finish school.
Yeah.
So to live with that in itself is traumatic. It's a hard thing to. It's a lot of pressure on anybody to have to finish school for an Aboriginal person is huge. And the statistics of youth injustice, it's from injustice. It's from the lack of support that Aboriginal people have received through colonisation.
Could it have anything to do with culture and a difference in values, where one culture, say non-Indigenous cultures, generally speaking, may value a in-school education attainment compared to maybe the education that might be garnered not in the education system, so to speak? Like, could that be part of the reason?
Potentially.
Okay.
I don't know. I think that, I don't think I'm knowledgeable enough to kind of
that's all good.
to make a
That's all
statement.
good.
But I
Yeah.
think that we're the oldest living culture in the world. We've been here for 200 years and we're killing our planet. Like, I think we need to start to think, why is that? Why won't we listen to why won't we treat Aboriginal people properly? to why
But when you say that, like, where are they not being treated properly? I know that. Sorry, like, just to really acknowledge what you said before, there are specific instances where people are racist,
Yes.
and I think most people who are reasonable will condemn those acts. Like, for example, what that
But people are still,
umpire
as you
said.
heard before, kids are still being taken from homes. The deaths in custody.
Why? Yeah, and why do you think that is happening?
Because people are racist.
Okay, so this is where I think we might disagree, but this will be good. I've been trying to make sense of why that happens as well, and my question mark is, if more Indigenous kids are ending up in custody, what exactly is the cause? Where exactly is the source of the problem? Is it, let's say, for example, the government draws a line here and says, beyond this level of abuse to a child, the government is going to step in and take the child out of the parent's custody.
Yeah.
If we hold that threshold consistent across Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations, and then there are more Indigenous kids in the state's custody, is that still racism if we're applying the same threshold?
As I said, I'm not knowledgeable enough within this.
No,
And
that's
I
okay.
honestly think that Uluru Statement from the Heart is something you haven't heard of. Do some research
No,
on.
100%,
It's
yeah.
something that's going to change. The government cut funding off to remote communities, especially across WA, and those people had to move off country, move to places they couldn't afford, and their kids are ending up in jail because they've got to do stuff to survive. Like we're not able; those people aren't able to live the life that they want to live in the remote communities they live. The government haven't been supporting them, and I think we need a treaty. I think a treaty will solve a lot of our problems.
Yeah. So where we can find common ground, I'm very much for constitutional enshrinement of an Indigenous voice. Exactly the specifics of what that would look like, I'm not sure.
And like for an example, when we didn't do burn-offs, so I don't know if you ever driven to the country and you see the side of the roads, they're burning off the grass.
Yeah.
So the first time ever we didn't listen to our Aboriginal people, we didn't do burn-offs, and the country lit on fire. That was when the bushfires happened a couple of years ago. The whole country lit on fire.
Yeah.
The first time the government don't listen to Aboriginal people and saying this is what you have to do to protect the land. So, and a treaty is a seat at the table to actually, it's not a maybe do we listen to these people, it's we have to.
Yeah.
And I think that it's not for the benefit of us, it's for the benefit of everybody in the country.
Yeah. And I also think that, the way that you establish a harmonious society, at least as far as I can tell, is you give everyone a voice.
Yeah.
Everyone does have an opportunity to contribute, which is what we're about in these conversations. It's like, no matter what your skin color, your height, your sex, your sexual orientation, whatever, you deserve a voice at the table to try and unpack some of these problems. Well, hey, thanks for taking the time. I really appreciate it. A YouTube channel called Common Ground Conversations.
All right.
And we're all about asking the important but controversial questions.
Yeah, I
and
saw
then-
you before.
Oh, awesome, man. Hey,
I saw
respect.
you.
I love that.
I
I love
saw
that.
you.
So, what? Yeah, you can jump in. So, maybe just quickly, what are your names? My name's Rich.
Zach.
Zach.
Garana.
Darren.
Arash.
Lovely to meet you all. So as you can see, we want to ask the question, what is racism? And then the follow-on question from that, and we have a couple of other sub-questions, but then obviously we want to fix it, right? If there is racism going on, I'm certainly against racism, hopefully you guys are as well, and how we go about actually fixing it. So, what is racism for each of you?
I believe
All good,
it.
bro, you can look at me, I'll hold the
No, I believe it everywhere, in the systems, what we built on, what we built a country on. And I believe everyone racist. To a degree.
Everyone is racist.
Everyone racist. To a degree, I believe.
Okay. What does someone have to do to be considered racist?
Racist? Not like other people, other cultures. Or just all around just don't like somebody called how they look, how they act, or what their background is.
Okay. So, I mean, if let's say, for example, I love all cultures.
Oh, culture.
Is there still a way that would you still consider me racist?
I don't think.
Alright.
No, you go. You tell me.
Yeah, go for it.
So for me, racism is basically any discrimination that is inherently based on race. There's discrimination, you can differentiate between people, but if you differentiate only on their race and nothing else, that's racism.
Agreed. I would agree with you. Would you guys agree with that
I'll agree,
definition?
mate.
Yeah. So discriminating for or against somebody based solely on their skin color is racism, and I am definitely not for that. I'm very much against it. Are you guys all against that as well?
Of course, of course.
So something I just want to read you a quote. Something that I find very interesting is my sense is the definition of what racism is kind of changing, right? Some people will call one person racist, but then we might say, no, that person isn't racist, right?
Yeah.
So, there are some terms that are undergoing what we might call semantic shift or semantic expansion, a fancy way of saying their meanings are changing. And so that's part of the reason why we're asking the question. I want to read you a quote from a book that I read. Actually, I'm going to read you 2 quotes.
All right.
One, quote, I have a dream, you might know who this is by,
Yep.
that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream of equality of opportunity. You guys know who that is? Martin Luther King, there we go. So, civil rights movement leader in the 60s.
Yeah.
I want to read you another quote from somebody else. Quote, if racial discrimination is defined as treating, considering, or making a distinction in favor or against an individual based on that person's race, then racial discrimination is not inherently racist. Would you guys agree with that or no?
Sorry.
Oh, what's up?
Sorry. Hey, can you roll me 1 too? Yeah.
So essentially, that quote is, if I'm not misrepresenting it, is saying that there are certain instances where it's okay to discriminate based solely on someone's skin color. I'm not for that. I would say that's racist. What would you guys say? Would you agree with that or no?
No, I don't agree with that.
As in, you don't agree with the quote?
No, I don't agree with the quote.
Okay, you?
Me? Oh, sorry. Can you say it again? I was unfocused on her.
Okay.
Go on, like good lighter.
What about you?
So if it's anything based on opportunities, then that's wrong. But then, for example, if we say, okay, as a lighter skinned person, you need better sunscreen, then you better get the better sunscreen. But I don't think that's what they were going for, so no.
Yeah, okay, so I want to read you another quote by the same gentleman.
Yeah.
His name is Ibram X. Kendi. He identifies as an anti-racist.
All right.
If discrimination is creating equity, then it is anti-racist. So that's the end of the quote.
Yep.
So to me, that sounds like there are certain instances where what we would classify as traditional racism, discriminating based solely on someone's skin color, he would say, I think, that it is acceptable in certain scenarios if you are aiming for racial equity, so racial equality of outcome between different groups.
Yeah.
I'm not supportive of that. I'm interested to hear with you guys. Are you supportive of that? Do you agree that there are certain instances where we ought to be traditionally racist to equalize outcomes?
I will say no for that. I will say no.
Yeah.
But
So he would in Ibram X. Kendi's worldview, you would be a racist.
I'll be a racist.
You would be a racist because you are not supporting ideas that promote racial equity. But hey, and I'm not saying you're a bad person,
No,
right?
no,
Because
no,
I actually agree with you. I agree with you.
I understand that. But like at the same time, you can label anyone racist. Like the police, for example, like the system they built on, right? They built on racism.
Tell me more. Tell me more. So why do you think that the police are
Racist?
racist?
Okay, say you and me walking down the street, right?
Yep.
Say I have a Koori flag on me.
Yes.
Koori flag.
Koori flag, yep.
Koori flag. Who's the police can come to first? You or me? Probably me first, right? 'Cause I have that on. I'm Koori. Like, oh, he probably did something wrong. Wrong, right?
Interesting.
Or, I don't know. Like, what your background?
I'm not indigenous.
Oh, different?
Yeah.
White? I assume white?
Yep.
Yeah. See, but like, they'll probably pick me first to come to you. Say, like, the little crime around the corner. Like 7-Eleven, someone went in, robbed it, came back out. They come to me first. Done nothing wrong. But as you come to me, I'm Koori. I remember it. Can I identify Koori?
Yeah. Have you? So I want to share an idea with you, and you tell me what you think. So,
All right.
I read this fascinating book called Disparity and Discrimination by a black gentleman from the States called Tom Sowell.
Yeah.
And sorry,
Great guy.
we're gonna have to move along.
Hi, sorry guys.
No, all good, mate.
The trams are just starting.
Lads, Darren, is your name Darren as well? Is it?
No, Gariner.
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 Sorry, I thought he was
Oh,
almost the
crikey, they've got
same.
cameras everywhere.
No, all good. Hey, boys, let's jump over here.
Oh,
Yeah, so Tom Sowell. So he wrote a book, Disparity and Discrimination. Apologies. And he introduces this idea of there are 2 types of discrimination. Type 1 and Type 2. Type 1, not bad. Type 2, bad. Type 1 discrimination is based on, is essentially based on evidence, whereas Type 2 discrimination is based on arbitrary unfounded stereotypes. So let me kind of dive into that a little bit further. Within type 1 discrimination, you have two types again. You have type 1A and type 1B. Type 1A is discriminating for or against the individual based on their individual characteristics. So let's say you and I have known each other for 20 years.
Yep.
We've known each other for 20 years. We've known each other for 20 years. I know each of your individual characteristics to such a degree that, let's say we were having a job application, I would be able to say, I'm going to make my decision based on the individual characteristics of each of you. Right? That's type 1A discrimination. So I'm discriminating for or against each of you based on your individual characteristics. It's a very Western ethos, treating the individual based, essentially not treating the individual based on a group identity, but on the individual's identity. Type 1B discrimination is suboptimal, but sometimes we do it. So type 1B discrimination is discriminating for or against someone based on their group identity when there is not sufficient data on their individual identity. So let me give you an example. And it is founded in statistics or evidence as opposed to unfounded in perhaps outdated or racist stereotypes. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you're from a particular gang and I'm from a particular gang. And you and I are walking down the street, you have your gang t-shirt on, I have my gang t-shirt on. Let's say that my gang is renowned for being violent, right? And let's say that there is good evidence that says my gang on average is more violent than your gang. If someone is walking down the street and has to choose whether they walk on my side of the street or your side of the street, they might discriminate against me and for you because they know that on average, people from my gang are more violent, right? And I would say that that's an example of, it's not ideal because I might actually be a very kind and non-violent person, and I'm not saying that you are, right?
No,
but
I may be the violent one out.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But that person doesn't know. So they're just assuming based on our group identity because they don't have a lot of data on us as individuals. So that's type 1B discrimination. It's suboptimal. We want type 1A, where each of us is judged based on the content of our character. Type 1B is where we're judged based on our group identity, but it's founded in some statistics or some evidence, right? That's type 1B. Type 2 discrimination is there's no evidence that your group is less violent than my group, and yet this person walking down the street still chooses you and your side of the street and assumes that I am violent because of my group identity with no evidence whatsoever. That's like rigid, outdated, biased stereotype that is unfounded in statistics and evidence. Not for that. But notice how both type 1B and type 2 discrimination could be considered racism, right? Because we are discriminating based on someone's skin color.
But the important difference there is that the top 1B, that, as you said it, I think even Thomas Sowell would say this, is based on characteristics that you have control over. So not where you're born or how you're born, but again, what gang you're in, what group you actively chose to be a part of. That discrimination is, I think, by definition not racist because, again, you're saying with the second type, it's based on how the circumstances under which you're born.
Yeah.
If you're not from a wealthy family, or you're black, or you're white, whatever, or you're born in a wrong country. But even if you're poor, you can still choose not to be part of some, gang or something.
Right.
But
So yeah, that's a really good point. Let's run the same.
Not really. Say you're born in an area,
yeah,
right? You say you hang there your whole life. You around there your whole life. You're around a group of people, right? And you're like, oh, they're part of the gang. You're more likely to join the gang, right? You've been around them your whole life.
Yeah.
You're born in that area. You're used to the life. So people say like, the environment, like the person or how you're born. I believe both come in a sense. Like how you're born and where you grow up.
Yeah.
And I don't think the whole, I can pick what I want to do.
I want to give you boys a scenario, and I want you to tell me whether you think this is reasonable. So let's say that a person is walking down the street. So similar scenario, a person is walking down the street and they have the choice of either going on the, let's just say that you're the male in this case and I'm a female, and a person is walking down the street and has to choose, it's late at night and they're concerned for their safety, they have to choose whether they stand on your side as the male or my side as the female. We know that males commit more violent crimes than females, right? And so I would say it's reasonable for that person to discriminate against. Wait, did I say you were the male or I was the male? You're the male, I'm the female. I would say it would be fair for that person to discriminate for me, right? Coming on my side of the street because I'm a female, and as a consequence, less likely to commit a violent crime of some sort. Would you guys agree with that? Do you think that's reasonable?
I agree.
Okay, so if we do the exact same situation with two groups, let's say they're racial groups, race group 1, race group 2, and let's say that racial group 1 has there's statistical, solid evidence that racial group 1 is on average more violent than racial group 2. And just to make it uber clear, I'm not saying that you're a violent individual. I just want to make it really clear. So let's say that the particular group, racial group that you're a part of, may have higher crime statistics or violent crime statistics or prevalence compared to my racial group. Is it reasonable for that person to make the same decision to cross on my side of the street as opposed to your side of the street?
I would say yes on that.
Yes.
I would say yes, because clearly he knows a bit. And my group is more violent. I mean, it's only reasonable for him to step away from me and go to you.
Right.
But say we didn't have that, right? And he went, oh, we want that go on. We're on your side. Wait. Sorry.
No, all good, man.
Yeah.
You're doing a great job of unpacking that with me. I want to take that one level deeper on specificity.
All right.
And I really respect the attitude that you're kind of bringing into this conversation. The incidence or the likelihood of Indigenous people to commit a violent crime is higher than non-Indigenous people. Right? So if we go straight back to that same scenario, would you say that it's reasonable for that person to discriminate against you and for me because of your Indigenous status and my non-Indigenous? Do you see, it's starting to get a little bit tricky.
All right, clearly, yes, I agree. But I'm Indigenous, right? I'm Koori. I'll do that. I know my own people. I met plenty of violent Kooris or First Nations people. I mean, I see him walking down, I'm gonna sit the other side.
Right.
I don't get, hit or punch.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're like black and black crime.
So it's really interesting here as well. Would we say that is racism, but okay? Do you see what I mean? Like whoever is walking down the street, they've discriminated against you solely based on your skin color.
Yeah.
Which ideally, like all of us are against.
Yes.
But we've just painted a scenario where we might say that it's reasonable to do so. Would you say that that's an instance where racism is actually reasonable?
So the important thing to note there is, first of all, nothing bad is being done to the Indigenous person based on that decision. No one is complaining, why didn't you walk on my side of the street? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that?
I give a simple situation, but it could have very serious implications.
Could have it, but at the same time, your right not to be discriminated against doesn't trump another person's right to choose how they want to live their life. It doesn't mean because we don't want any discrimination, they have to continue walking down the path they are. They have the right to make the choice how they want to live their life, whatever it is, whatever it's based on, right? Now, the important thing is that the government or any person, when doing something that would benefit either the Indigenous person or the non-Indigenous person, would not make decisions solely based on race. it's important if you want to hire someone for a job that you don't look to their color, to their skin, but you
100%.
look at their resume.
100%.
But they do. You know, I could be wrong about this. I could be wrong.
No, that's
Don't
okay.
quote me.
Yep.
But I believe workplaces have to have a Korean or a Third Nation person. They have to have at least a certain amount of them in there.
Are you saying they
They
like
have
legally?
to,
at the
legally they
moment?
have to have
Right,
it.
right.
Don't quote me on that.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
I'm not 100% sure,
Yeah, that's okay.
but I believe they have to.
I know that there are some. What is it called? Like quotas.
Quotas,
And then
yeah.
maybe they're legally mandated, maybe they're not. But there are certain organisations that have quotas for Indigenous people.
Wait,
Yeah.
say
How do
again?
you feel about having those quotas? Do you feel like that's them being racist towards Indigenous people?
I would say yes on that. I would say yes, they're being racist.
And do you support that or are you against it?
I would say I'll support that because giving Aboriginal people work, get them out of trouble, get them off the streets,
Yeah.
like give them a life when they get to work, get money, you know, have a good life.
Do you, let's say for example, you and I had the same job application
Yep.
and we had the same experience, we were the same age, and we both had an interview and they couldn't tell, like the interviewer loved both of us because we're both champs.
Yeah, of course.
And then let's say that they had a quota.
Quota.
Do you think it's fair that they choose you over me solely based on the color of your skin?
No, I don't believe that.
Okay.
That's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. They should not do that.
Right, so I guess that's the concern that some people
Person.
have with regard to
Yeah.
to
I think-
to quotas.
Quotas.
I think if it's the last thing you think of, then I would be fine with it. Like if
And
they've
yeah, why is that?
if they've considered everything else and said, all right, these two people are equal, and we want to do something good for the group that's been wrong all these years.
Yep.
So we would like to give the
Proactively.
job to them. But if it comes
Isn't that
before,
interesting? Sorry to just interrupt really
yeah.
quickly. Isn't that so interesting that might actually be a case where we are pro-racism? If we, and maybe I use that term in inverted commas, but pro-racism, given that we've done everything possible to distinguish the individuals based on their character, but then at the very end we're like, okay, because we can't distinguish between the two, given their group identities, we do want to, on average, the Indigenous person may be less advantaged or may have less opportunity on average, and therefore we're going to choose that person and give them the opportunity. So it's like we're deliberately trying to base our decisions on the character of the individual, but there does come a point where the group identity of the individual is considered. And that's where I think that that's a part of the conversation that I think is being missed. So I'm glad that we brought that up. Sorry to interrupt you. Were you going to say something else?
yeah, so I'm fine with that. But as I said, as long as it's the last thing,
Yeah.
absolutely the last thing they
Yeah.
can think of.
Yeah.
But another thing on the quotas thing, it's it seems good and it seems like a good idea.
It seemed like a good idea.
But the thing is, especially in education, and this is from America. I don't know how Australia does it, but in America they do also have quotas and such, and that's why Asian students have to have higher SAT scores than white students because there's too many of them going into good schools. But what happens is, when a black student that is like the best at his school and gets really good marks and wants to go into a school, because schools are like, we need more black students so they're easier on him, what happens is there's a misrepresentation of black people in really good schools.
Yeah.
Now that seems good, but the problem is when you take people who wouldn't naturally get into those positions to come to Harvard or MIT, what happens is when they start failing because they're not as well equipped as the other
on the
kids,
level of the kids.
when that happens, those same people drop out, and the dropout rate for black students in America is a lot more than other students, not in high school, in universities, when they've decided they want to pursue a professional career.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point, man.
And the bad thing there is now you have the top 5% of black students you've given them something they're not ready for. They go into these schools, they fail, and what happens is the top 5% that could have become doctors, engineers, all this stuff, are now dropouts. Nothing's happened with them. And that's where it could go horribly wrong because of this thing.
And that's where, so I'm very much a believer in, I have this mantra of problem first, solution second. I think lots of people are very, very quick to say, this is the solution, this is going to be the one that solves the problem, before having properly identified and defined what the problem exactly is, and then thought about all of the implications of all the potential solutions. So problems first, solutions second. And I think that might be one instance where you can have very good intentions proposing a particular solution, but not necessarily consider the long-term implications that may not be so good. So best of intentions, but actual implementation of a solution that hasn't been thought through properly can be counterproductive. Out of curiosity, so if we are, I guess there are so many questions that we can dive into. Well, I might actually let you boys go so that we can have a chat with some other people, but I really appreciate like all of you jumping in and kind of unpacking this with me. Stay in touch, boys, because we,
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too, man.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. We're called Common Ground Conversations on YouTube, Insta, TikTok, and yeah, we're all about having these combos. Yeah. So yeah, let us know if you have any questions that you want us to ask. We're usually here on a Friday around Fuji Street Station. And if you ever see us around, just like say hey.
Hello.
Awesome, boys. Take care. Catch you around. So what's your how would you define or describe racism as far as you're aware?
It's a socially constructed concept that is now upheld in society by a lot of our systems.
So like it's systemic or it's structural?
Systemic. It's systemic, but it's built because of structure. So a lot of times our structures also maintain the racism that we see.
Right. So this is where by the way, we're called Common Ground Conversations. We want to ask these important but controversial questions and then see if we can find common ground. A lot of the questions we ask, I'm still trying to figure out for myself. Some of them I have more of a clear position on, others I don't. I'm still trying to figure out, say for example, with structural racism or systemic racism, what exactly that looks like. What would you say are some of the structures or systems that you think are in place that we need to try and combat?
Our educational institutions, so starting from the very bottom when kids get into kindergarten, going up into post-secondary, and even just the way that we structure what education is and how we grade and assess and we say what's right and wrong, it's built on.
For different races?
Because it's what you're learning, it's how you're perceiving the world, because it's a perception, and so if you're taught something in one way, you often perceive it in one way, and a lot of times that feeds into racism and the way that we treat others and we value others.
Could you give me a specific example or something just so I understand better?
Sure, I'm from Canada, and I know the
Welcome.
issue. Thank you. I know the issue
Whereabouts in
persists. Calgary, Alberta.
Alberta, okay. Oh,
Yes.
it's Jordan Peterson's.
Yes.
Yeah, lovely. I'm very familiar with Jordan's work.
Interesting. Okay, yeah. And so for us, something that we're really working towards, and I know I think it's a topic here, but it's reconciliation. And so we look at the way that in Canadian schools, social studies is taught, and the legacy of what our residential schools, which was the unfair treatment of Indigenous peoples. And so that's not even taught for many years. It wasn't even taught in the school system. Rather, it's taught from a very European perspective versus coming from an Indigenous perspective as well. We even think about ways of knowing and looking at how you approach a topic in your own personal ways of knowing. So when we look at Indigenous ways of knowing versus a non-Indigenous way of knowing, they're very different.
So I think where we can find common ground there is that I also, my understanding is in the Oz system, it's also very important for young people to be taught history, not just from a colonial perspective. You don't want it to be one-sided, you want it to be as objective as possible. So making sure that students are aware of Indigenous culture and Indigenous history as well is very important, so we can definitely find common ground there. The second point that you just mentioned around ways of knowing, can you tell me a little bit more about that? And because I did a Bachelor of Science at Melbourne, so I'm very much like scientific and analytically minded.
Interesting.
And the ways of knowing idea, or there being different ways of knowing, it hasn't quite clicked for me. Are you able to open my eyes and explain that a little bit further?
I guess where I would go with that is looking at kind of how, so when you talk about from a scientific perspective, often that scientific perspective does come from a very European system, whereas if we look at ways of knowing and indigenous ways of knowing, of sitting with the land and looking at different ways that plant-based medicines per se, and the way that those are taught to individuals, it comes into that worldview perspective again, and so it's not that one is right or wrong. It's not that our typical science or European ways of science are wrong in any way. It's just rather it's looking at things from different perspective. It's the way it's told to us. So in indigenous cultures, elders pass down stories. So storytelling, verbal storytelling, is a way of knowing and a way of perception.
And so I guess I know that some people, and there's a part of me that also believes this too, which is saying, there's a voice in my head that says, if it's not science, then it's not true, right? If it's not empirically verified, then it's not true, and any other way of knowing is secondary to science. And I know that some people on the other side of the argument might say, well, that's your Western or colonial worldview.
Yeah.
I can see the merit in both sides to a degree. So I think where we might find common ground is, I think there are certain instances where we intuit what science hasn't yet proven. So for example, we might have a particular herb or plant. We might say, let's just take, for example, ginger, just some random example here to demonstrate. And we might find that over eons of cultural development, we found that this particular plant or substance helps our health in a certain way, but it hasn't empirically been proven.
Right.
That's not to say that we don't know that it works.
Yes,
right?
great
So I think that might be an instance where other ways of knowing, you can know things or intuit things as being true that can then later be verified with science. I guess where I have issue with it is, and this is speaking from experience, I was very close with someone at one point who said that all ways of knowing are equally valid, and I had an issue with that because I don't think that all ways of knowing are equally valid. I think that things proven objectively and empirically verified with science are truer than something that someone might intuit as being true. Would you agree with that, or do you think I'm missing something there?
I think to a certain extent. I think you just have to. I think it comes down to when we go back to like institutionalized. It's kind of who's telling you at what point though what's valid and what's not valid, right? So I do think that there's obviously, you're right, not everything is valid, but you have to look at the way that society is structured, and like if it's a different society, like a Western perspective carries more weight in our society at this point in regards to what is correct. And so
is that because we live in a Western society? Like, wouldn't we expect that if we live in a Western society or we live in a Western culture?
But I think you have to look backwards at colonial powers, and it's a power imbalance. So yes, we live in a Western society, but there's many people who live in this Western society who do not have those same worldviews, who have worldviews from their lived experiences, whether that's how they were raised, where they were born.
Can we agree on the idea that your lived experience is, in terms of claims, so okay, let me backtrack a little bit. When it comes to making truth claims, my sense is there are two types of claims we can make. We can make subjective truth claims and we can make objective truth claims. So I can say, I feel hungry, or I feel like a man, or I feel like XYZ, and you can't tell me otherwise. That's a subjective truth claim. That's my truth. But then I can also make an objective truth claim, which is something that can be verified empirically. So I might say, I can run at 10 kilometers an hour. That would be an objective truth claim. Or gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared, whatnot. And again, an objective truth claim. Where I have an issue with lived experience is when people say all ways of knowing are equal, or that lived experience is just as valid as science or objective truth. that's where I guess the word valid, we need to unpack that as well. But I would say that your subjective truth, just as, I'm not sure if valid is the right word, as mine, and important, and I acknowledge that you're a sovereign individual, I'm a sovereign individual, but at the same time, if you make a truth claim that is about objectivity, something that can be empirically verified, and I make a truth claim about objective reality, that you saying it's your lived experience and me saying it's my lived experience isn't enough. That's where we can say either you're right and I'm wrong, or I'm right and you're wrong.
Why can't both be true?
Well, what if they are claims to what if they are objective truth claims that conflict? So let's say,
Such
for
as
example,
racism, someone interpreting something as racist versus non-racist.
can I
Right.
let's bookmark that. Let's come right back to it. I just want to give you one example. If, say, for example, I said gravity or what's the speed of light is 300 meters per second, something like that, whereas you say it's 300,000 meters per second, 200,000 meters per second, that would be an instance where we can't be both true. One of us has to be right. And you might say that your truth is that it travels that fast. My truth is that it travels this fast. But then science is a way of objectively analyzing who is objectively correct. Do you see what I...
Yes.
So, okay, so I think we can find common ground there that
Yeah.
lived experience is important. And I think that's some people miss that aspect. Lived experience is important, but also lived experience doesn't mean that all ways of knowing are equally true. Would you agree with that? Or am I don't mean to put words in your mouth.
No. I suppose they're not equally true. I don't know. Yeah.
Maybe equally objectively true.
Yes. That. I
Okay,
would agree.
okay, awesome,
Equally objective.
common ground. Now, about racism. So if I say something, that was a really good question you asked before around like, if I don't think it's racist, but if you think it's racist, is it racist?
Intent is really important when you're thinking about racism and consent. We're talking about sexual harassment, which is often intersectional with racism.
Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Oh man, did I just open another?
Is that another rabbit hole? Okay, well, so
We
before
had that
we
conversation today, didn't we? It's so weird. Like 2 hours ago, we were like, the other day I said to somebody, oh, where are you from? Because they had a different accent. They had an Italian accent.
By the way, both of you have
And-
beautiful accents.
Oh, thanks. England, Canadian. And they went to me straight away from Australia. But like, you could tell straight away the body, the way the body language changed. And I was like, shit, have I come across racist here? And I was like, but my context, the way I asked, it didn't mean to come across like that. So, yet that person perceived that. So,
Yeah,
again,
right.
when we were talking, I was saying to Lindsay, was that racist of me? The way should we be asking that? And I was like, but yeah, I believe it's all down to context. I didn't mean for that to come across like that.
Yeah.
But
So
we have to be aware of the way people might respond, I guess, in this day.
But does that? So let's say, for example, you say something about my appearance,
Yep.
and or my accent or something of the sort, and I say that's racist, or I feel as though it's racist. Does that make it racist? Is it based on how I experience it, or is it based on your intent? What do you think?
I think it's
Yeah, both, isn't
a
it?
bit of both. I think
Yeah.
it's really important to validate the experience and the feelings that somebody has and dig deeper and to have those conversations and be open to why someone might have felt the way that they did.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily mean it is. But it doesn't mean it isn't. Like it's a conversation.
It gets so tricky. Yeah, so I've had this quite recently with transphobia, where, and perhaps I'll might seem like that's out of the blue, but I'll explain it in just a moment.
Very
Where I have a particular stance on biological females having their own change rooms as well as their own sporting categories, and in expressing my position, I'm very much pro-trans inclusion where possible as well. But at the same time, I don't think it's appropriate for trans women to be able to use female, or for females to not have female-only safe spaces, right? Which is another way of saying I don't think trans women should be allowed to use those female-only safe spaces. Now, that said, I certainly don't intend to be transphobic. and I definitely don't, I wouldn't consider myself as being transphobic, but lots of people have labeled me as transphobic for having that particular belief. Does that make me transphobic?
I think it's the way you approach it. If you were to come across and say females should have their own space, transgender people should have their own space, and males should have their own space, it comes across like I'm seeing this all equally.
Yep.
Whereas if you come across with, I think women should just should have a separate category from trans people.
And then
the
not
way
addressing what happens to the, what about the trans people who want to compete?
You've got to come across equal to both. Like you're not valuing one set of people more than others.
Over another. Yeah, no, that's a really
that's
good
the way
point.
I see it,
Yeah. Would you agree with that?
To a certain extent, but I also think like then you're almost isolating. So then you're isolating.
Everything's like.
It depends all the time.
It
So
is.
I think one thing is what conversations are we allowed to have absolutes in either, right? I mean, you present as male. I assume you're male. I obviously can't make that assumption.
What do you mean?
well.
Yeah. What do you mean present as
So-
way as male?
Socially conscious, and again, we can get into this rabbit hole. Oh my gosh, it goes.
Rabbit.
It's
I love
so
rabbit holes. Let's go.
Intersectional.
Struggling, eh?
Intersectional is
Okay.
like.
Can
there's
you,
so
can you
much
tell
of
me
it.
a little bit? I've heard that term before.
What,
Intersectionality. Yeah. So.
It essentially, like, nothing can happen in isolation, right? So you have race, gender, sexuality, nationality, all of that stuff, and it compounds. So the way that you experience your life is compounded by this intersectionals that you have. So if you are, personally, white, female, heterosexual, that's kind of those three, and they make up part of my privilege and how I see myself and how others see me, versus, and the way that I'm treated and the way that I'm allowed to take up space in certain institutions per se, or in structures of government or policy and procedure, right? How I'm treated. So everybody's intersection is different, and so anytime you're talking about a certain issue, it has to come from so many different angles, so many different intersections.
Yeah.
in
Okay.
order
So.
to come to a conclusion.
I love the way that you phrase that last part. Like you have any issue, you want to try and tackle it or see if you can view it from different angles. And I think that's the beauty in diversity.
Yeah.
Is the idea that we try and consider all possible angles, knowing that each of us has blind spots. I think
Yes.
that's one part of, I know that some, for example, more right-leaning, politically speaking, right-leaning people will say, hear the word intersectionality, checked out, done with it, don't want anything to do with it.
Yeah.
That's where I think acknowledging that there is validity or there is good utility in having a diverse group of people with a diverse worldview so as to best tackle complex problems. Where I don't agree, or where I personally have issue with intersectionality or the idea of diversity at, to infinity is better, is I don't necessarily, what I value is diversity of ideas and worldviews, right? And sometimes we use different things as proxies for those worldviews. So we might say, given that you're Canadian, given that you're, was it British? Yep. And given that I'm Australian, we might have three slightly different worldviews. Given that you might be from a particular ethnic group or a particular sex, whatnot, you might have a particular worldview that allows you to see something that someone from another group might not. But I'm also very aware that reducing someone solely to their group identity is a real loss of the value of individuality, and recognizing that, let's say for example, we grew up in the same town, we might still have a huge amount of diversity in our worldview, even though we might have on a superficial level all of the same characteristics, skin color, we might have the same accent, we might have grown up in the same town, etc. So I think that's, like I said before, we're about establishing common ground. That's why I think one side of the political spectrum misses the value in intersectionality or diversity, but then also the other side of the political spectrum can go too far in saying intersectionality and diversity is the be-all and end-all, more is better.
Yep.
And I think that's one thing that I think is really tough right now is, I think more than ever, to be honest, COVID kind of forced us into huge polarization of the left and the right, and the conversations have stopped happening because
100%.
people turn off when they hear certain words.
100%. Why do you think COVID kind of like accelerated that already?
It was extremely polarizing in the, to be honest, I think a lot of it came down to our institutions, our governments had to step in, or did step in, and had to make a lot of political decisions, and that's what really polarized people. I think it really brought political views to the forefront. People who previously you thought you aligned on with certain topics, it really brought to light if you aligned or didn't align on certain things.
One last question I'd like to ask the two of you before I let you go is, when that happens, when there is a particular issue that arises and we disagree, so let's say that we were close friends for ages and ages, and then boom, there's a big issue, becomes politicized, and we heavily disagree on it. What is the appropriate way in your eyes for us to solve that issue?
Well, I worry, because I would say that I'm quite left-leaning, that people on the left, like my side of the spectrum, shout down anyone that has a different opinion. Plus, and I've seen it amongst my friends, like, but then on the opposite side of things, you get it on the right side.
Totally. You have Nazis all the way on the right? Mm-hmm. So any claims of ethnic superiority, I think like everyone would say, no, sorry mate, you're out of the conversation. Like we do not tolerate that kind of attitude.
A lot of my left-leaning friends will just call people that support people like Trump, will just call them stupid. And it's like, no, actually, let's engage why do you support Trump? Why do you support these people that you dislike so much? Let's actually discuss and find out what they like about it, rather than just being, you're stupid, we're not talking to you. And that upsets me a little bit.
So something that I think a lot of conservatives miss, so more right-leaning people, is that there is value to the left. There is value to progressivism. You have to be able to draw a line between the radical left so that you can draw a line around the reasonable left and actually engage in dialogue and understand the utility of their worldview.
Yep.
The same way you have to be able to do it with people on the right. You have to be able to draw a line somewhere and say far, extreme right, radical right, whatever you want to, alt-right, whatever you want to call them, and separate that from the reasonable conservatives who, again, can come to the table, have that dialogue, and actually work through some of these complex problems.
An example of that was when Donald Trump got banned from Twitter, and he started his own method of social media. I don't remember what it was called, but essentially the argument was that now that he is off mainstream Twitter, these conversations are happening in isolation, and so really it's only one side taking part in these conversations now, versus when he was on Twitter, regardless of the, in my opinion, crazy things he said, there was two sides of the conversation always being happened, and that dialogue was still there. Now that dialogue is happening in isolation, and we're losing that conversation piece.
Love that. Yeah, it's almost more dangerous, because if you have extremists who on either side of the political spectrum, if you have extremists who establish an echo chamber somewhere and you don't expose them to civil, respectful, open dialogue where you can actually question their beliefs and pull them closer to the center, then you risk
storming the Capitol.
Yeah. Well, you
confirmation bias. They're like, oh, everyone must agree
with
us.
Exactly, right? You end up with two echo chambers on either side, and both sides pointing to the other and saying they're the villain, I'm the good guy. And it's like, well, as soon as you, kind of what you were saying before, as soon as you label the other side as stupid or a bad guy, it's like you are fundamentally missing the empathy required to understand their position and come to the table and have a constructive conversation.
Yep.
Hey, this was really lovely. I appreciate you guys taking the time. Stay in touch. We're called Common Ground Conversations on social media.
Common Ground.
Yeah. Awesome.
Well,
Take care,
so
guys.
much.
No, my pleasure.
Cheers.
See you.
Take
Ciao.
care.
So, we, just to kind of give you some context, we run a YouTube channel called Common Ground Conversations. We want to ask the important but sometimes controversial questions, and then see if we can find common ground, unpack some of these more complex problems. So, and we were down here for the NAIDOC week march earlier today. I assume you two were here before.
Absolutely.
Yep. So, what do you think racism is? How do you define it?
I'm pretty sure the definition of racism is discrimination coming from a position of power. So in this situation, we are run by a white government, white people, colonisation. So racism refers to when that position of power discriminates.
So sorry, I just realised.
That's all right. Am I not rolling?
Yeah.
Say it again.
No, go for it. I think we had this one, so we can use that one. Sorry to interrupt
No,
you.
that's
So
all right.
we're
So
white government.
Yeah, white government. So that are in the position of power, and it's the minorities that they discriminate against, and that's what racism looks like. Whereas
When you and sorry, just to jump in there,
Yeah.
when you say discriminate against, what would be an example of the white government discriminating against Indigenous people?
well, police brutality. Yeah, I mean, if you look at any statistic involving minority groups, not just Aboriginal people, but especially Aboriginal people, like we've got. It's so disproportionate because any policies that
Say in the prison system, I know
prison
there's
system, school
overrepresented.
system, mental health system, like
Child
health,
custody services
child
taking
custody, yes, absolutely. Even in like clinical settings, dental, all of it. Anything that you look at that has a statistics, we're down the line.
and so why do you think there is the difference in outcome between, say, Indigenous and non-Indigenous? Like if we look at, for example, incarceration rates, where the Indigenous population is disproportionately incarcerated, what is the cause of that, and how do you fix it?
Well, that and the government creates their laws and regulations based on white society. So if a minority group doesn't fit into that structure, then we are outcasts. So we've got our own law, like Aboriginal law, which is LORE, and so LORE.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, sorry, the government's law
Sorry,
is
that took me
LAW.
so long. I was like mentally spelling it
Yeah.
out. Yep.
So we've got our own rules about what that looks like and what happens if we break it. But the government's law doesn't reflect our laws, and so we're always
to tell me
breaking
understand what's an instance of where there's a difference between Indigenous law LORE and say Australian law LAW.
So yeah, respect is a massive one. Kinship, so family.
Can you give me an example of respect?
So we respect each other. We respect our elders. Most importantly. Our land is a huge one. That's we get everything from the land, so we need to respect the lands, and so that keeps going. So we
destroy trees, no littering,
all that sort of stuff. But when you've got the government, it's all about the economy and financial gain, and so. Like, if you look at Aboriginal law, for example, we will trade based on equal value, whereas the government trades based on monetary value.
Like economics, yeah.
Yeah.
So that might be something I'm also very interested in is how when you have, say, two different cultures coexisting or cohabitating in a place like Australia, how do you navigate the two cultures having different values? So let's say, for example, Indigenous culture might place a higher value on taking care of the land compared to perhaps a more westernized culture, and then how do you navigate coexisting in the same space and
it's about respecting everyone's beliefs, to be honest.
And then the most important thing is acknowledging all the pain, the suffering, and everything that's happened. And that doesn't mean just the government. That comes down to everybody. Acknowledging the differences in people and valuing the different inputs that both sides have. We're not at a stage where we can collaborate just yet because that basic respect is not there.
Right, yeah. So something that I think we might find common ground on is I'm very much supportive of a constitutionally enshrined Indigenous voice. Not sure exactly what it would look like, but being able to have a seat at the table and make sure that, say, for example, again, it comes back to that difference in values between cultures. When there is a problem or a decision to be made, it's beneficial having people from both cultures there to discuss it.
And amounts of people on both sides.
So yeah, on that, let's say, for example, Indigenous people make up 3% of the population. Would you say that then 3% of the people, say, in Parliament ought to be roughly Indigenous?
If you go from that, but when you think about custody rates and like health problems, we make up 25 to 50% of that. So why only look at the population and not the issue itself? You should have equal, up to 25, 50% sitting at the table, because that's how much negativity that we're facing.
Right. Okay. So let's say child. I was looking into a couple of stats to kind of try and better understand the situation. So let's say, for example, I actually made a table. I might just pull it up real quick.
I love tables.
You are going to love this table then, because I actually put in so much effort to try and understand this situation. So I made this table. It's kind of a small screen, but here, child protection rate, 8 to 10 times higher for the Indigenous population, 2019, 2020
that's a
data.
perfect example of what, like the difference in culture. So what we think is appropriate for our children it's not reflected in Western society. And we've had issues in our own family with kids in care, and we often get overlooked or pushed to the side because how our family works doesn't align with Western.
With the kind of officially enshrined law.
Yeah, or
Okay,
even
I would love.
what's deemed appropriate as a family unit.
What would be an example, a specific example of something that Indigenous culture might deem as appropriate or acceptable, that Western culture might say, or that is currently enshrined in law, is unacceptable? Say, for example, in such a way that in Indigenous cultures it would be fine, but it results in the child being removed from their parents.
So a lot of the time, what it looks like is, when we're letting our kids say, like if you think like a bit more free range, so the way that our kids learn a lot of the time is through experience. You've got like a lot of kids who are deemed like have ADHD because we are kinesthetic learners. We learn by doing.
Yep.
And when...
That's so interesting.
Yeah, and so, like, for example, my mother, who's just there, is the matriarch of our family. And so what happens is she's a gathering
Would she be interested in joining the conversation?
Maybe, I don't know. She's not very good at talking, but I can try. But she's the gathering point for our whole family.
Yeah.
So I'm one of 7, but they get concerned about the amount of people that are in the household. And they're like, no, we need background checks on every single person, She looks horrified.
Hi.
Yeah, we're talking about...
We're asking people, what is racism and how do we solve it?
Oh, she answers all those.
Yeah, no, but we're looking at it from
She mentioned you're the matriarchy of the family.
She is.
That's a whole different ball game there.
No, it's not, because I'm just talking about how you're like the gathering place, and then when we work with DHS, they frown upon that because it's different to Western values. So
Yeah, and something that I would love to ask all of you is, and I had a chat with someone earlier today about it, how, let's say, for example, the law draws the line here for a certain degree of, or a particular behaviour or something of the sort, where the government will then step in and seize the child, right?
Yeah.
So for the child's safety.
A good
So
example
hold on. Let me finish the point just real
it's
quick.
really hard, I know.
And so with that, how do we ensure that there is some kind of consistent standard to make sure that any child who is unsafe is taken care of, without, or whilst also acknowledging the difference in, say, values or norms in child
They
rearing?
need to stop tokenistic training and acknowledgement,
and
because that's all it is. It's just tokenistic stuff.
hang on.
And
So, for example, when someone steps up on stage at a school assembly and says, we'd like to acknowledge the
that's a very,
traditional...
very tiny fraction.
no,
Does that bother you, or are you for that?
I'm for it if it's heartfelt,
Yeah.
if it's genuine, if it's meant.
How do you tell?
Oh, we can tell.
Yeah.
We can tell. 'Cause
Yeah.
if
But,
it's
but when
scripted, then we
departments
just
are doing it as a tick box thing, so they can tick their box to say we are being culturally safe and appropriate.
But then
when they're
making
not.
policies and rules and regulations
As
about
Aboriginal
how they're going to
women,
treat Aboriginal
A
people.
classic example is families that say in the winter they'll pull all the mattresses in the lounge room and sleep together. That's the warmest room in the house. It's everybody hanging,
Sleepovers,
chilling.
they're the best.
Yeah.
When everyone's... Yeah.
And child protection will walk in and see that as a bad thing.
Yeah, right.
The kids are meant to be in their own rooms, in their own
Yeah,
space.
fascinating.
And that,
Okay,
you're
so
not-
that might be an example of what you were talking about before, where the kind of formalized Western, this is how child rearing ought to be, may not be
And
may not be the
biggest
same.
issue we have is Australia itself is very open to cold groups and different cultures there, but are less open to our own
to First
culture.
Nations.
And a lot of the times they try and stick us in under the cold groups.
So
if
another,
you think of funding, it'll say Aboriginal and cold.
yeah. Christian, come around this way if you don't mind. Christian's just going to come a little closer because some people are kind of walking in front of us. Another thing that I'd love to ask all of you about, sorry I haven't included you in the conversation, you've got two prams over here, is something I haven't had the chance to kind of unpack today with people is we've touched on child custody, we've touched on Indigenous incarceration. Something I'd like to touch on is domestic violence. So why do you see there being a higher victimisation rate of domestic violence within the Indigenous community?
Because it's in Aboriginal women, so it's not necessarily Aboriginal men that are perpetrators. It's because Aboriginal women were at the bottom of the food chain. So, and when we go and seek help, we are often treated as the villains. So our kids will be removed from us because we sought help. So how are we meant to change anything when it's not safe to even go out and seek help?
But also, too, if you think about, say, people, a death that's a result of a domestic violence situation, it's more because black women will fight back. And that's why.
Sorry, can you explain that? I
They
didn't
fight
quite
back,
follow.
so it becomes more aggressive, more full on, more intense, the whole everything. Whereas in a lot of other cultures, it's accepted, it's okay. It's,
So women are treated, like in our culture, for our family especially, the women are the matriarchs. We run our family. In a lot of other cultures, the women don't. The men run it. So
Yeah.
they often don't fight back. We run the family. We don't take nobody's shit.
I'm just, yeah. I don't take no. Yeah.
That's why you get a lot of that. That's why you'll get the bruising. That's why you'll get the death. That's why you'll get all that, because they fight back.
Yeah, right. So what do you see as, if we can kind of draw a circle around that and say this is an issue, Indigenous women and domestic abuse, how do you solve that problem? Like, what's the root cause of it?
Colonization is the root cause of it, because it's not actually in our culture to do that.
Right.
So when you think about intergenerational trauma and all the things that happen from the beginning, and everyone's like, that was 200 years ago, get over it. It is a domino effect in the generations of family, and especially if you're removed from that culture that says no, and you come from a like white culture, hugely patriarchy, huge. Like the men run everything. In our culture, that's not necessarily the case. Not for
You've
everyone.
also got law versus law.
Law versus law.
Yeah, we spoke about
just
law
spoke
versus
about
law as well.
So, when we're looking at trying to help build things against that, unless we've got enough people to battle the colonization laws, then we're not going to get anywhere.
So just to...
We've spoken about funerals today.
Yeah,
Funerals?
she's a funeral. She manages the Victorian Aboriginal funeral.
Can we bookmark that for just a moment? Because I have a question that I just want to ask all of you. So something that you just said before around Indigenous women being at risk of domestic violence, and the root cause of that being
very complex,
colonialization, and potentially intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
So when I studied medicine for a short while, and we looked at how intergenerational trauma works and how going through a traumatic experience can influence gene expression and the silencing and turning off, and then it can. So it doesn't necessarily change the underlying genetic code, but it influences the expression of that genetic code, and so you can inherit trauma from your parents.
So, for example, a pregnant lady, if she's pregnant with a female, that's 3 generations in one traumatic experience.
Yeah, and it can be passed on.
Yeah.
So my question for all of you, and this is where we really try and play devil's advocate with whatever position we speak to. Yeah. So does intergenerational trauma ever become an excuse for not taking responsibility?
It depends on the person and the group. Now, we as a family unit don't allow it to, but that's not to say that we speak for every Aboriginal family or community out there. What we do know though is without proper support from the government, nothing's going to change. And again, it comes back to the fear of if we actually go and ask for help, our kids are going to be taken away again, and they are. The numbers show that they are still disproportionately being removed. So if we were to actually say, we want to change this, how do we know they're not going to rip us apart?
One of the biggest examples is they tell you there's help available.
But there's no help.
The moment you go and get help that is held against you, the stigma attached to it.
Yes.
and everything is huge.
Can you give me a specific example of that? So
anyone with mental health, they go and get some assistance for their mental health, and then next minute, the moment Child Protection or some other agency want to step in, they will use your mental health against
and
you.
if you're
in an
already
instant.
like vulnerable, like with mental health issues, like you already struggle to stand up for yourself. They're just going to come in and like roll you over, steamroll you straight down to the ground. And what are you going to do to fight it? If you don't know the services in and out, if you don't know your rights as a person, if you don't know your rights as a parent, like it can just be taken away from you by people who do know those laws.
Are you, each of you, so in trying to educate myself in this kind of arena and what's going on here, I've tried to research all the different voices that are trying to contribute to the conversation. One that particularly interested me was Jacinta Price. Are you familiar with Jacinta? Yeah, so I know that she, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of her position in certain instances is that Indigenous Australians can be infantilized in the sense that they're kind of treated as incapable of taking responsibility by well-meaning non-Indigenous people, and that she can take offence to that. She can kind of view it as a kind of, the soft bigotry of low expectations, something like that.
Okay, before we get on that,
what's your take on Jacinta?
Price in general, she speaks for her experience maybe up in the top end. There's so many people that argue against that, but she doesn't speak, like I just said before, this is what happens in our community. I'm not going to say it happens in every community. She tries to say that it does happen in every community. She tries to alienate Aboriginal men. We're trying to build our men. Why is she trying to tear them down? Like, if you come
or
from
stigmatized, perhaps.
them, they're already stigmatized. They don't need that.
Yeah.
What we need is actually something proactive and strength-based to lift them up and get us to where we need to be as a people that is equal with everybody else.
Men have really lost their place.
They have, like when they were the
Indigenous men.
Yes, they were the ones who, they were the strength. They were like, so you think about,
They had different roles, men's and women's roles, and now they have nothing.
I wouldn't say the brains of the operation, but we're nurturing. We can think about the kids and everyone as a whole. The men, they had their role. They were there to protect us. They were there to look after their families. They were there to make sure that everything was passed on. They were there to,
And they probably drew a strong sense of meaning from
exactly.
that as well.
And so when you take that away, what do you have?
Yeah, right. And then so something I've been trying to make sense of as well. Like I'm also interested in what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. I'm on my own journey about becoming and stepping into my manhood. And one of the things I'm very aware of is I draw a lot of significance and personal self-esteem from my sense of meaning. And if that's taken away, it's not good for my mental health.
Well, if you look at any of the other minority groups, so like LGBTQIA+, for example, like how many of those actually have so many mental health struggles because they're struggling within themselves and in society to be identify with who they are as a gender. Or it's not necessarily about, sex or sexual attraction. It's in themselves as a gender, what's my purpose, what's my role, what does that look like, what does it feel like? Like, if you don't have a community around you that supports you and only brings you down, you're just going to end up on the ground.
Just to come back to Indigenous men having lost their place, what do you think can be done to remedy that? Right? Like, what's the solution here?
It's a very simple one. Is if you see a black man walking around in the supermarket, don't automatically assume that he's going to be there stealing stuff. It's like, so there's so many microaggressions and casual racism in society. If we point that out, we become the bad guys that are like, oh, we're playing the victim card. No, it's a real thing. It's happening to us. Listen to what we're saying. Our brother, like we've got 4 brothers, 3 of them terrified to walk into the supermarket and speak face to face. They're like nearly 6 foot, like big black men, and they're scared of cashiers, like because of the way that they've always been treated.
They might be profiled.
Yeah.
One last question that I have for you before perhaps we have a chat with these guys is in I guess something that I want to put my finger on is in having an Indigenous voice in Parliament, being, say, constitutionally enshrined, we touched on something before around Jacinta Price not necessarily speaking for your
You need a variety
So
of
how do we
voices.
do you have any ideas of how we would establish a constitutionally enshrined Indigenous voice that is capable of speaking for all the different Indigenous voices?
Well,
Does that make sense?
Like, for example, we're looking at treaties, for example, and that has been a huge thing about what it should look like. And you've got so many different tribes that have to try and have an input. And we're working against people who come in and try and identify as Aboriginal without actually living the Aboriginal life, taking our jobs. So then you get
People identifying as
yeah, they do, because it's not
What
legally.
we call Johnny Come Lately.
Yeah, or 9 to 5 blacks.
what's it called?
Johnny Come Lately
Or a
or
job.
9 to 5 black.
Somebody who's only black for work hours. So they take our roles that are designed.
Sorry, just so I
I've
understand,
got
because I've
jobs.
never heard of this before.
There are some jobs. How have you not heard of this? There are some jobs that have, identified positions that
Specifically for
Particular quotas for Indigenous Australians.
But even then, like, for example, you have
like-
an Aboriginal role to bring in an Aboriginal perspective, but then you've got somebody who identifies but never lived black, and they've come in,
Right.
Yeah.
Like
right,
the
okay.
local council, Swan
Interesting.
Hill, when they said,
Yeah.
"Oh, we've got so many black workers. Okay, who are they?
Where
oh,
are
we
they?
can't tell you that. That's privacy and confidentiality."
We're a
So
small
I
community.
actually
how we greet each
Yeah.
other is, "Hi, who are you? Who's your mob?"
Where you come from?
Yeah.
Who's
So
your family?
I keep saying one more question because I do want to have a chat with these guys. One last question. I remember watching a very interesting documentary on a lady called Rachel Dolezal in the US, who was genetically speaking. Do you remember her? Genetically speaking, she is Caucasian,
But
she identifies
No,
as
she didn't
black.
grow
So
up black.
can you
No.
identify as a particular
we've
race?
got-
Like, can you identify as Indigenous?
We've got.
Or do you have, or is,
Not
unless
unless
you
you
are.
are. Your blood.
Yeah, been
Right.
saying that.
So
though.
there's
We've
like a
got
genetic aspect for you.
family,
Yes.
for
Yes.
example, as well, that if they grow up with us from youngness, we will actually include them in, because they will face a lot of the same issues. But at the same time, we've got to be careful about that because, especially with our law, for example, there's only certain people that can know certain things. Like there's knowledge that we don't pass on to non-Indigenous people. So we can't really accept them as completely into our tribe as a whole Aboriginal person because they don't have the rights to a lot of that knowledge. That there is ancestral stuff. Yeah, it's spiritual.
So you need to be part of that kind of gene pool
Yeah.
to
Yeah, so like for example, we're not from here. I would never come here and do a welcome or do a traditional dance without asking for the elders
and for
here
permission.
because it's not our land. It's not our place.
just so that I understand, when you say like an opening, is that, do you mean?
Welcome to
Like a welcome to country, yeah. Or
So
an
you-
acknowledgement of country. We
right,
do
so
an
you-
acknowledgement, not a welcome. They're different.
Oh, okay. That's a learning for me
Acknowledge
today.
the
Okay.
traditional owners of the land or
Yeah.
welcome to your land.
Yeah.
Right. So you would do an acknowledgement,
here.
but you wouldn't do a welcome.
No,
Yeah.
because
Okay.
it's not our, it's not
Yeah.
our
Really
place
interesting.
to do it.
Really interesting.
So, and that's the same thing. Like, just because you might be accepted there, it's not your place to go in there and take ownership of that knowledge.
And also, just like you asking me coming over, it's not my role to be the speaker. That's her role.
Yeah, I'm the speaker in the family apparently. Everything that we do, you articulate
You're the
well.
voice of it.
You
Yeah,
go.
yeah, love it. Well, hey, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. If you want to stay in touch, it's called Common Ground Conversations, where we try and ask the important but controversial questions and then try to find common ground. So, yeah, I really respect the way that you held yourself in the convo. Hey guys, how are we?
How you doing?
I'm Rich.
Sorry, what was it?
Rich.
Rich?
Rich.
Nice to meet you. I'm May. May, like the month.
May.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you, May.
Ro.
Nice to meet you, bro. So, gents, are you familiar with what we do? Have you?
Yeah, I've seen it on TikTok and
Yeah,
stuff,
awesome. So, we want to ask the important but controversial questions, try unpack them, and then try and find common ground from there as well. So, today, as you can see, we're asking what is racism. It's NAIDOC week, so we thought it'd be a great opportunity to kind of get into the city amongst Indigenous people, ask for their position. For the two of you, what is racism, and then follow-up question to that, how do we solve it? How do we fix it?
So racism, simple question I think, is just judging someone based on the colour of their skin, where they come from, based on physical characteristics they can't control their ethnic group, their racial group, and judging them harshly based upon that. how do we solve it? That's the difficult part of the question, you know?
Bookmark that for 1 second because I want to get your take on racism as well, and then let's see if we can kind of unpack the solution.
Simple definition is it's discrimination based on race, and there's obviously a lot of context to that, as in racism encompasses more bigotry than just race, like culture. Like if you make fun of someone's culture, that doesn't necessarily have to do with what race they are. That's also branched under racism.
I see what you mean, but you would also classify that as racism.
Yeah, because you don't really have a better word for it, do you?
Yeah. Apart from bullying, maybe.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we all find common ground there. I would say that racism is the discrimination for or against someone based solely on the arbitrary colour of their skin.
Yeah.
And I'm very much against it. I don't think it's a good thing. In a very like Martin Luther King sense, I think we should each judge each other based on the content of our character. My part of the reason why we're asking this question as well is the word is undergoing a degree of semantic shift or expansion where it's beginning to mean different things for different people. So some people will say that racism is a set of systems and structures that result in lifting one racial group above another, and that we can have a racist society without having racist individuals, right? Does that make sense? And that's where I'm still trying to understand people who have that position. I don't necessarily agree with it just yet. But having established, okay, we share a definition of what being a racist is, and what being a racist looks like, how do we fix, let's say for example someone is racist, what is the best way in your eyes to remedy the situation or fix that?
I think racism is taught. It's not something that is innately within us. So I think re-education, for instance, is a good way to fix racism. A lot of racism comes from hate, comes from predetermined ideas, especially in the older generation. That's how they grew up. That's what they learned. So I think relearning those morals in yourself, it's going to be a long road, obviously, to that, but just resources that can help teach better understanding of diversity of cultures, of races, and how it can bring people together rather than segregate us.
100%, I love that. And I think I agree with everything you just said. I think that that one of it can sometimes seem cliche to say education, but I honestly think that's the best way to open people's eyes to our shared humanity. Right, we can be from different races, different cultures, etc. But fundamentally, we are humans, and I truly, I think that's primary. We have to keep that in mind, and the best way to be reminded of that is for us to actually spend time together, and for me to be exposed to your side of your neck of the woods, and you be exposed to my neck of the woods, etc. Do you see another solution to it, or?
Well, my solution would be a follow-on from that, which is say, to remedy someone who's like an individual who is racist, I feel like the best way for them to get over that is experience with someone of that race that they have that prejudice towards, because like you said, it is taught. Racism is something that is, you're not born with it, it's not innate in people. But when someone holds these ideas about an individual, to sort of fix that is it's to spend time with them to realise that what they know is actually wrong. There's no reason to judge someone based on a predetermined set of ideas until you get to know that, like the content of their character.
100%. I love the common ground that's going on here. Before I ask you the next question, boys, are we good for camera? Like, do I need to do a camera change, or you're good with that? It looks a little low on battery. He's got plenty. All right, beauty. So. Next question from here. I want to run an idea by the both of you. Sure. I've only run this by one person earlier today, one or two, and I'm still trying to make sense of this myself. So I read this book that drew a distinction between 3 different types of discrimination, 2/3. So the gentleman who wrote the book is called Tom Sowell. The book is called Disparity and Discrimination. Great book, would highly recommend it. And he broke it down like this. He said that we can say there are 2 types of discrimination. One is okay, sometimes necessary. The other, not okay. We have to avoid it. So we can label those type 1 and type 2. Type 1 discrimination, the one that we would sometimes deem as necessary or acceptable or okay, we can break down into type 1A and type 1B. Let me know if you get lost at any point in this.
Yeah.
Type 1A is where I discriminate for or against you based on the individual characteristics, of your individual characteristics. So, right, like we might have known each other for 20 years, we've known each other for 20 years, and then I make a decision to discriminate for or against one of you in a particular role or whatever. Yeah, not right now, thank you.
No. What, you're not talking to other people?
Oh, no, definitely. Hey, if you want to jump in the conversation maybe in 5-10
What do you
minutes.
think about people that are gay or bisexual?
Can I answer that question after we've done this one? So I would say that the type 1 discrimination, type 1A, sorry, I'm
type 1A.
is where you discriminate for or against someone based on their individual character.
Yeah.
And we do this all the time,
Yeah.
right? And that's the very Martin Luther King, discriminate based on someone's character, not their skin color. Type 1B discrimination is where you discriminate for or against someone based on their group identity that is rooted in empirical evidence. So let me unpack that.
Yeah.
Let's say, for example, that maybe before I unpack that, I'm just going to give you the definition of type 2.
Yeah.
Type 2 discrimination would be discriminating for or against someone based on their group identity that isn't rooted in empirical evidence. It's just rooted in an unfounded bias.
Yeah.
So let's unpack type 1B and type 2. Type 1B, there's someone walking down the street, right? And they're walking towards us, and there is a male on one side and a female on the other side of the street. The person walking down the street, let's say they're concerned for their safety, they might go, I actually don't know the individual characteristics for these two people, the male and female, and therefore I can't make a judgment call based on the contents of their character. What I do know is that males are more likely to perpetrate violent crime compared to females. And therefore, this person may, based on empirical evidence associated with the group identity of those two people, discriminate against the male and for the female. It's suboptimal because you actually don't know the individuals.
No.
And in that case, the female very well could be the violent or more violent than the male. But I would say that in a situation where there is limited data available on the content of the character, it is reasonable that we use the group identity as a proxy or a shortcut for making the decision when necessary. But again, it's suboptimal. Type 2 discrimination would be walking down the street, seeing someone of a particular group, regardless of what group it is, and just going, I just don't like those people because of the way they look, the way they dress, whatever, and therefore I'm going to go to the other side of the street. And so my sense is that type 1A, ideal. Type 1B, sometimes necessary when we have limited data on the content of the character of the individual in front of us. Type 2, we have to get rid of. And the best way to do it is through education. It's exposure to that person or that particular group to kind of break down that unfounded stereotype. Did that all make sense to begin with? Okay, awesome. Because sometimes I'm still trying to make sense of this myself.
Yeah.
So,
well explained.
Thank you. I appreciate that. In an instance like that, let's say, and this is where we're going to kind of we're going to dip our toe in a little bit of radioactive territory. Let's say that someone is walking down the street, and instead of it being male and female, it's racial group 1, racial group 2.
Yeah.
And that racial group 1 has low crime rates, low violent crime rates, and racial group 2 has higher racial crime rates. How does the person walking down the street make their decision as to which side of the street they're going to walk down?
That's a good question.
Yeah, tough hypothetical.
That's very ultimate to me. But
I know that I'm putting you on the spot here.
Yeah. But
again, I'm kind of in the radioactive territory with you.
Yeah.
Is it reasonable for that person to use the racial group of that person who they don't have a lot of data on in terms of the content of their character? I mean, how else would the person in that situation walking down the street make a decision with regard to what side to cross on? if those two people look identical in all other respects?
That's an interesting one and a very specific hypothetical. But I suppose in that case, I would still have to say judging based solely on race, even if you know one has a higher crime rate than the other, is still an unfair judgment in that context, because I think there's more important factors to look at, like why the crime rates are like that. You have higher
100%.
incarceration
I'm
rates.
with you. I'm with you.
It's
so
almost
it's
like
you're jumping into a new problem or a new rabbit hole.
And it's also very like, no, this isn't like how people make decisions either. Like, no, these feelings of discrimination are usually more instinctual than reasoned. They're rarely does someone go, oh, this person comes from a group which has a higher crime rate, therefore it would be in my best interest.
Right.
They just kind of instinct, like.
And the question is it type 2? Right? Is it type 2? Where
it would be
that subconscious.
It might be type 1B on like a subconscious level.
I feel like the type 1B subconsciously, you've still got some of that type 2 in there regardless, because
but it's very difficult to draw the line between
people who are bigoted. People who are bigoted don't have that reason. Like you said, they don't have that reasoning. All they know is that they don't like this group because they don't. A lot of the time, if you ask people, they don't know why. It's because of rhetoric they've seen on the internet.
Totally. So I think that's a really good point where you can figure out whether someone's, dare I say, racism, like in that point, I would say that is racist, whether you're doing it type 1B or type 2.
Yeah, by definition.
But how do you determine which one it is? Maybe you ask them, what makes you have that response one way or the other? Is it because you've researched the data and you are letting that inform you of your decision, or inform your decision, or is it just like a gut feeling one way or the other?
Yeah.
That was so interesting. Thank you for going down that rabbit hole with me.
No problem.
I'm just wondering, is there any other question that I have to jump into with racism? I think we unpacked that really well. Were you guys waiting for some mates?
I have work.
You got a tram to catch in like 4 minutes.
Yeah.
And I was meeting a friend at a piercing place, but I think I don't think we're getting.
Both of you sound like you could have a podcast. You both have really like nice timbres to your voice. I don't know whether you've ever been told that. But
No, definitely.
well, there you go. Take it with you.
Thank you for being respectful.
That's a very good compliment.
No.
Timbre, my voice. I like that.
Oh, well, I have a musical background, so I appreciate timbre.
What music? Like what kind?
I produced some Melbourne bounce when I was like 18, and then I rap a little bit. So Richard Jackson on Spotify, you'll find me if you're interested. But I also I want to acknowledge we were able to unpack that in a very respectful and reasonable manner as well. So
Seen a lot of the stuff on TikTok, people jump to conclusions, and that's why I wanted to come up and have a conversation, because you don't always know the viewpoint. Just because you do have this controversial, thing on you, people might assume you're racist and then act, accordingly.
I just really wanted to gauge what was going on, like what sort of the intention behind this sort of setup. Because it is provocative in a sense.
Especially for an outbreak.
Out of curiosity, what if you were to describe it? What was your initial kind of sense of who I was before you came in versus now that we've had the conversation? And I won't hold it against you. It's just interesting for other people to hear as well.
Honestly, beforehand, it was sort of a here we fucking go like type of deal. It was like,
one of those types. Louder than Crowder type of change my mind, very...
It's interesting as well to actually be able to converse, because you do have... in these sorts of situations that I've seen like online, it always tends to be the case that it's two sides trying to force their way down the other's throat. Yeah. Like it's very like jumping down the throat rather than a discussion.
And I definitely felt like this was more of a discussion.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
How would you, if you were to try and put your finger on it, what differentiates the discussion we've just had from something like Louder with Crowder, Change My Mind?
I think a lot of that because this feels like a more intimate conversation, whereas what I've seen with Louder with Crowd are people yelling from the sidelines and arguing purely with emotions and anecdotal and stuff like that, trying to combat this guy who has an encyclopedia of information, and they're not well equipped, I guess, to discuss discuss appropriately.
The point I'd really like to make about Change My Mind is it's very contradictory to the title, because he doesn't want to have his mind changed in any of those instances. He's going out there with the intention of spreading his viewpoint, and it's just interesting that you came out here and just asked questions and just gauged general opinion. So I think that's what distinguishes it more, is you were looking more for what people had to say That's so interesting, because I've also had a similar criticism because we call ourselves Common Ground Conversations. Yeah. And some people have said, oh, well, you already come up with your mind made. And just because we are trying to find common ground doesn't mean that I don't have my own beliefs and my own position.
Of course.
Yeah.
But
I am very much open to, what do you believe and why? What do you believe and why? And is there something that I'm missing that I can bring to the table, you can bring to the table, we hash it out and then leave with a more, complete understanding
more whole understanding of both sides. Because I think an understanding of both sides is important in any issue, 110%. Regardless of how controversial that opposing viewpoint might be. Yeah, I kind of do.
Hey, I want to say thank you again. I really appreciate it. You guys have an awesome night, and stay in touch. Hi, how are you doing? What did you say? You're not racist? No. I'd love to. Yeah, would you be down to have a quick convo about what?
I'm from New Zealand, man. It's very racist.
You're from New Zealand?
Yeah.
And it's more racist over there?
Yeah.
Yeah. How would you define racism? I'm Rich, by the way.
I'm M.
M, lovely to meet you, M.
Yeah.
How would you define racism?
Discrimination of, just because of the colour of your skin.
Yep.
And also, not just that. Oh yeah, it is. And your beliefs. But yeah, I grew up in New Zealand. I was minority white at my school.
Interesting.
So we had 600 students and there's about 200 white kids. Because that's what we white and blacks. That's how I grew up.
Yep.
Which is quite racist to say that nowadays. But yeah.
Interesting, because some people would say that that's racist. Some people are fine with the terminology.
I was called a honky, and I was actually beaten up because I was a white girl.
Interesting.
So,
we literally just had a conversation with a young person who said she didn't want to be filmed, and we were fine with that. But I asked her off camera.
Where is this going to be filmed?
Common Ground Conversations. It's our YouTube channel.
All right.
I asked her off camera. We kind of unpacked it quickly, and she said, "You can't be racist to white people. It's not possible."
Bullshit.
So, what would you say? What would you say to people who hold? Because she said, and I'm not putting words in her mouth here, or I hope I'm not. She said that racism is discriminating against
coloured.
But it has to be a person who is from an oppressed racial group. And given that white people are not oppressed in her eyes, she said
was she from 1800?
No, she was about, I think she was about 18 years old, so a young'un. So
wouldn't have a fucking clue.
What's she
needs to
missing?
go and sit in my hometown, man. It's actually better nowadays, but I grew up, and I'm not going to disclose my age, but 600 pupils. There was about 200 white kids. The rest were Samoans, Tongans, Maoris, and they all also in New Zealand. The thing is with New Zealand, it's a melting pot, but it's also full of different cultures that actually clash too. So there's a lot of clashes between the Maoris, the Samoans, and Tongans.
Right.
I'm not saying this is like a full-on thing. I'm just saying that
but there are different
that's
cultures.
what I grew up with. So I haven't lived there in decades, but I do notice it when I go back. There's streets in Auckland at night. Don't go down if you're white. You do not walk down there if you're not white at all.
And why is that?
Because it's very dangerous.
Yeah.
And there's parts of Auckland that are very fucking racist.
So
and there's certain areas, and I won't disclose that on camera, but I would not go down there if I was a white chick. No way.
So
and that's shit.
Yeah. And so I think that's perhaps what some people would miss is that I certainly think that you can be racist toward white people, black people, Asian people, whatever.
Racism is against everything, every colour, every race, whatever.
Yes.
That's very narrow-minded to think that you But
Well,
like,
so to play devil's advocate here, I know that some people would who hold that position. They, thanks, mate. They tend to
look at
say.
this hairdo.
They
No, I'm
tend,
serious.
They tend to say something like racism is a system of power and oppression. You don't necessarily need racist individuals to have racism at play, right? It's a structural issue. That is a very much critical race theory,
Yeah.
systemic oppression
Yeah.
kind of position. Do you believe that there is such a thing as systemic racism? And if so, what would it look like?
I just know on an individual level and just in society, and I just find we are not evolving as humans, man. And I think COVID and lockdowns has made people even more aggressive and
Exhibit A, that guy walking past.
and not accepting to others, and that's shit. Like, we're all here. End of the day, it doesn't care if you're like black, white, green, fucking blue. We all have the same feelings, right? We all go through the same shit. Grow up, teenagers, like, have kids if you're lucky, or if you're unlucky, whatever. Well, I don't have kids. I think I'm lucky. But racism, I just find it's more rampant than ever, and I think it's wrong.
Interesting, more rampant than ever.
Yeah, totally.
What do you think is the solution to racism? So let's say you can say these people are
I don't have that solution, man.
Okay.
I think the internet has got a lot to do with it. I think social media has got a lot to do with people tearing other people down, and so that's not just a racism thing. You've got sexism, you've got homophobia is fucking rampant in this day and age. So it's not just, I don't believe racism is just the only issue here.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of social issues have been accelerated because of the internet and social media. Stay off internet. Internet. Stay off the internet, man.
I love how you'll be saying this to people who are on the internet right now.
No, fuck it. No, seriously.
I have one question that just came to me as you were speaking there. Another question we've been asking is, what is a man, what is a woman, right? Can you identify as a man? Can you identify as a woman? What does that look like, etc.?
I'm pretty sure I know what the fucking answer to that is.
Well, okay, so I want to ask you two questions.
Yeah.
One, do you believe that identifying as a man or a woman makes you such? That's my first question.
Look, I've got like, you're talking transgender, or what are you saying?
Yeah. So, like, for example, I'm a biological male.
Yeah.
If I feel like a woman and I begin to identify as a woman, does that make me a woman?
I've got no idea, man. It's not my call. I think as long as you're happy.
You do you. I guess the
Yeah,
reason
you do
why
you, man.
the reason why I was asking is something that came to me earlier today, but it kind of slipped my mind in the middle of a conversation. Was, can you identify? If we can identify as male or as man or woman,
Yeah.
can we also identify as other races? Because there are some people who have identified as, I know that there was a gentleman who identified as Korean, even though he was Caucasian. He had certain surgical procedures to make him look more Korean, and he said
Really?
on the inside, I'll have to find the name and maybe I'll pop it up somewhere.
Wow, it's freaking
But there was
deep, man.
so check out a lady called Rachel Dolezal.
Yeah.
Rachel Dolezal. She was a lady in the US who identified as being black,
Yeah.
and she was white.
But now you're going into, I don't know, man. That reminds me of Michael Jackson, and look how he ended up. So I don't know. I don't know, but
I don't know either. I know.
Well, I'm not being like.
I love how
just think,
we've just entered radioactive territory, and both of us are like, hands up, I'm
you're
out.
born the way you are, man.
Yeah, we are, man. Common Ground Convos. Yeah. But hey, thank you for taking the time. That was a lovely conversation. Take care of yourself. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is a wrap for today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I just want to acknowledge how beautiful an experience it was to share some of those convos with everyone on the day. You know, despite the radioactive nature of a lot of the questions, being able to maintain that deep-seated sense of collaboration and respect is really what we are all about. So if you want to support what we're doing here at CGC and you believe in the Mish, then one, drop us a like on the video. It helps signal to YouTube that this is important and other people ought to see it. And two, subscribe to the channel if you want to get notified when we drop our next episode. If you want to have more of these conversations in your own life as well, you can grab yourself a deck of our controversial conversation cards. We made these because we wanted to gamify the process of asking these questions, an easy way to skip the chit chat and go deep with family and friends. And now you can do the same with your own set, so there'll be a link for those in the description. With all that said, I will leave you with one last thing, ladies and gentlemen. Remember that your curiosity is not a crime, it is a virtue. So stay curious, stay open-minded, and stay connected with us on Insta. Shoot me a DM. And until next time, take care of yourselves. I will see you in the next ep. Ciao. Yeah, the boys.